We're here at the beginning of another season of Off the Page. My name is Leslie Choice, and I'm going to bring you interviews with many really fascinating Canadian authors and some from beyond Canada. We're going to talk about all kinds of things from disasters to spirituality, poetry, fiction, short stories, and more. Some of the authors that we have lined up for you this season include Micmac historian Daniel Paul, Newfoundland young adult author Kevin Major, we have Joan Clark, the author of Latitudes of Melt. Science fiction writer Monica Hughes from Edmonton will be here with us, as well as Governor General Award-winning writer David Adams Richards from New Brunswick. Carol Bruneau talks about her new novel, and also we have Linda Johns, who writes about living with birds, lots of birds in the house that she lives in. M.T. Dunny from New Brunswick speaks about the new novel that she's written and about her life in Newfoundland. Janet McNaughton will be here as well, and Toronto editor Michael Benedict gives us the story about great Canadian disasters and survivors, and there'll be more. So we have creativity, we have inspiration, we have all kinds of interesting things for you in depth this year on Off the Page. And right away here we go to our first interview with Dennis Lee. I'm Leslie Choice, and I'm very pleased to have as a guest today children's writer, poet, Dennis Lee from Toronto. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Leslie.
Good to have you aboard.
You bet.
Your new kid's book is called Bubblegum Delicious. Are you a huge fan of chewing gum?
Do you know, I was a complete bust as a gum chewer when I was a kid, and I'm still, somebody asked me to blow a bubble earlier today, and I cannot do it. No, it's, I don't know if it's something about mouth structure or just what, but to me when I was a kid it was a very macho thing to be able to do since I couldn't do it. You know, like whistling with your fingers.
So
like
the
that.
book is a kind of compensation?
I think it is. That's correct. That's correct. You know, you grow up and you finally try to exorcise the demons of 4 years old or whatever. To tell the truth, the title, which is one of the poems in it, Bubblegum Delicious, it really was just the tumble of syllables that just kind of danced around in my head. Yes,
that's right. You like those sounds. Now, your verse, in a way, it's very traditional. What is the great tradition of children's poetry?
Well, in English, it has to start with Mother Goose. You know, I mean, that's one of the great treasures of the language. And if someone hears that for the first time, it may bring you up short because, of course, it's something that children start enjoying at 18 months or 2 years or whatever. To call that a national treasure or international treasure may seem weird, but really it's where the sense of delight in language and you know, just sound and rhythm bouncing along in an incantatory way, that's where it starts for most native English-speaking children.
And I guess most of those poems are written by the very famous poet Anonymous.
Absolutely. You know, we don't know how far, well, some of them you can tell linguistically how far back they went, but it might be anywhere within a few centuries that they got started. Some of them probably detached from one thing and attached themselves onto something else, you know, and they got honed just in the oral tradition over generations and generations. One of the interesting things about that great tradition is that much of it to us now is kind of exotic. 3 little pigs went to market. Well, for most people who don't live near market towns and may not live in a rural setting or anything to do with farming, because most people don't now, all that can sound sort of quaint and ye olde. But for the people who wrote those things or said them to their children or the children who heard them, it was absolutely what their day-to-day lives were like. You know, there was nothing exotic or strange about it whatsoever.
Who were some of the other great ones along the way?
In the children's?
Yeah, children's poets.
Well, the ones that I love are certainly the ones that are pretty much the great names. Robert Louis Stevenson, Lewis Carroll, who was just spectacular, A.A. Milne. Maybe those would be the giants for me. Yeah. There are some contemporary people who do some nice stuff too. There's a lot of stuff written for children that is actually quite condescending. That if you can't cut it as an adult writer, the really tacky version of this goes, then you try to write for children because it must look, looks simpler and easier, and so you can probably do that.
That's right, there's fewer words. Oh, I could write that many words.
That's right,
Can't
that's
write
right.
a novel,
Yeah.
but I know you're not like that. How important is sound and rhythm to these poems that you
Oh,
create?
they're absolutely important. It's where the whole thing begins. Nursery rhymes classically start with a line that may have very little literal sense, but it just imprints in your mind. Peter, Peter, pumpkin eater, hickory, dickory, dock, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick. Your body just kind of starts dancing to them long before you figured out what it is that they're going to mean.
And then they stay with you forever.
They do, and for a writer, it sounds a little bit odd again, but that is a kind of pure challenge that you don't get in places where all sorts of lofty meaning or elaborate imagery or whatever are a sort of safety net in a sense. If you're trying to work with vowels and consonants and make it work as music, either it does that thing or it doesn't work at all. So it's there is no safety net when you're writing this kind of thing.
You're not necessarily trying to build in that lofty meaning into your poems there that are spoken by insects and such.
Well, some of it, ideally it's going to resonate on all kinds of different levels, but it absolutely has to start with that music, and often that'll tell me at least where the thing wants to go.
Okay.
I love it if it hangs an unexpected left turn just because that's where the sound of things carried it.
Maybe you can read us a poem or two.
Let's do that. Let me see. Hobby, as you will know, the collection kind of swerves between quite gentle and pensive and inward and very much the opposite. So Hobby, I'll start with an opposite one and then we'll do one of the gentler ones. Goober and Guck. There's this little character. People don't know the book yet. The boy and his best friend in the world, the dog, and they go around and they do stuff.
Sounds like a plan to me.
Insofar as there's a storyline in the book, it traces them through a day or a series of days. We don't exactly know. The adventures moment to moment. So here they are preparing things probably out on the sidewalk and selling it to passersby. It's called Goober and Guck. Goober and Guck, Goober and Guck. We're making a sandwich of Goober and Guck. It won't make you healthy or bring you good luck, but gobble it down and you'll quack like a duck. You'll quack like a duck and you'll smell like a truck. So eat your nice sandwich of Goober and Guck. And on that note, we could switch over to the...
So no big, heavy, underlying significant meaning there.
Are you telling me you didn't get the
Well, I was
17 levels of
looking for it,
symbolism
but
there?
it wasn't jumping. I'd probably have to read it 3 or 4 times,
I
as they
think
say.
probably it is so profound that you didn't even glimpse the depths of symbolism that lie beneath.
Well,
It's
wait
more
for the critics to dissect.
I hope so. Yes. Goober only carries, I think, about 6 or 8 levels of symbolism, but it's the Guck where the really heavy-duty stuff enters. It's called "You Two Lie Down." It's the last poem in the book. Over every elm, the half-light hovers down. You lie down too. Through every shade of dusk, a hush impinges. Robins settle to the nest. Beneath, the deep earth breathes. It breathes. You too lie down. The drowsy room is close, and come to darkness. Hush. You too can sleep at last. You too lie down.
Very nice. Did I hear the word impinges in there?
You did.
Well, that's a very interesting word to include in a book like this, because it seems to me that some editors would say, well, you can't use that word because that's a word that little kids won't understand.
Yeah, it's precisely a word that little kids and older kids will not understand right away. And again, if you look at Mother Goose or other children's poetry, a lot of it is made up of words that the child is coming to for the very first time. That's where a lot of kids form some part of their vocabulary. And that's part of the reason why that incantatory sense of the energy of sounds and rhythms bouncing around in a memorable way, that's why it matters.
Yep.
And so, I mean, if a word is made up almost completely of words that a child isn't going to recognize, then that doesn't accomplish anything useful. But for there to be words there that sink into the kid's consciousness but are unfamiliar as yet. I think that's great. Yeah.
Do children know something about language that adults don't? In other words, something that we lose along the way?
Well, you know, there's a particular age. I can't remember now if it comes at the same time that kids are doing that year or so, such wonderful things often visually on the page, and then suddenly everything becomes right angle houses and, you know, smack on the ground. And people sometimes say, well, that's because grown-ups insist that they get much more realistic. But it isn't just that. It's some part of the flowering of the child's visual sense. Well, similarly with language, there's a point when a kid has learned to put a number of words together into a string or some kind of a sentence. And then the whole thing becomes plastic, you know, and there's that wonderful thing. They'll be talking along, and they'll hear a run of words that they like, and they'll go back and repeat those 3 or 4 words, just, you know, sometimes so it drives you crazy, but the sheer sense of it being plasticine, being a medium that you can just kind of go like this with. And that feeling of language as just a toy to play with, a medium to jump into and swim around in, that lasts again with most children, I think. It comes 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. I'm not with a young child anymore now, so I can't quite remember.
And when we get older, we get real practical about language.
Well, we tend to, and it isn't too much after that. Like, that doesn't even go on with most kids till they're 10 or 12, though there are other kinds of delight in language that you'll find in children at that age. But there's that glorious point, and certainly part of the pleasure for me in writing kids' poetry is to try to touch back into that sense in myself of the language just being that, you know, just charged with kind of electric possibilities.
Is that why you write for that audience?
I don't even know why I do. I do because, you know, it's a kind of need that I have. But certainly that's part of where the pleasure lies, is just rediscovering the medium all over again.
And your poems are not particularly preachy, as sometimes we think about, you know, adults writing poetry for little kids to teach them this lesson. Why is that the case? Or tell me if I'm wrong here about that.
No, I think you're quite right. I think you're quite right. I hope out of them, across the length of a book and several books, would come a feel for certain humane ways of being together, but they certainly include lots of things that are by no means preachy. A lot of, there are interesting questions here, you know, because there was such a reaction against Victorian children's literature, much of which was just so tediously moralizing, and people were just setting out to mold passive young character by repeating things ad nauseum to children in verse or in moralizing fiction. And that was such a pain in the butt that there was in the 20th century a big reaction against that. The truth is, at the same time, that I mean, it seems to me that we do want children to grow up with a sense that you know, courage is better than cowardice, and honesty is better than dishonesty, and that being loyal and taking chances, and I mean, there are kinds of things that I would hope to see instilled in kids. It's just that preaching them as abstract virtues is pretty counterproductive.
Not a good thing.
No, and I think we also have to find a way of including the knowledge that we're very complicated, and there are many sides of ourselves that aren't always the ones that are going to get treated as virtues, but I don't want to just deny them.
Yeah. Dennis Lee is my guest today, and we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back right after this. My guest today is Dennis Lee. We're talking about language, and what's your favorite word in the English language?
I love the question. I don't think I have an easy answer. The word that came into my mind, although it isn't my favorite word, but I loved the sound of it as it came in, was diminuendo.
There's a good word. We must have borrowed that from Italian or something.
I presume that, yeah, it comes from Italian.
It has that ring to it. You've got your book open. Read us another poem or two, if
Oh,
you
right.
would be so kind.
Book is open at The Indigo Stallion. Another bedtime poem. Deeper than daylight, when evening has spread, the indigo stallion appears at your bed. You're up and you're off with the wind in your hair. The indigo stallion can fly through the air. He carries you high and he carries you wide on a super galactical indigo ride. He carries you far to the land by the sea. Then he brings you home safely to Mommy and me.
Very nice.
One of the gentler ones, and we could switch around again. You will have noticed that on the way through, there's a whack of bugs, beetles, roaches,
Two levels
grasshoppers,
going
insects.
on here.
That's right.
Something that the insects are.
Yes,
have other
roach lit.
voices, there are
Yes,
other
they have
poems.
their own missions and their own version of poetry, which is the kind of thing that we chant in schoolyards when we're young, and hope that our parents or other adults will look shocked as if they had never said such things themselves at the same age. Say, don't say that. So here's one of them. There's about a dozen of these kind of threaded through, sneaking their way into the illustrations. People, don't be shy. Step right up for your toe jam pie. You get 1 for a tummy ache, 2 for a bed, and 3 for a coffin when you fall down dead.
You wrote song lyrics for Fraggle Rock, and you had a hand in writing 2 of the Jim Henson movies. How did that world change you, or what did you learn from it?
The songwriting I came to from poetry, and that was very interesting because the thing with doing song lyrics is that you can't just treat them as poems that music is then going to be set to, because if you do, the words will be far too dense. You know, you have to, it's the same medium, and yet it's a different medium. It's like a novelist starting to write plays or film scripts. If you fill every available inch up with words, you won't be respecting the new medium that you're working in. I found I could make that switch. I worked with a guy who did the composer, Phil Balsam, and we had a good chemistry together. But that was something it was fun to learn to do. I was doing that in my 40s and 50s.
You left that. Did you leave that behind you?
Well, we still do some songwriting together, but that sort of had its natural time, particularly with the Jim Henson stuff with Fraggle Rock.
Yeah, Fraggle
We
Rock
did
was
other
a
kinds of
wonderful
songs
show.
too.
Now you're an adult poet too. You've won the Governor General's Award for your poetry, Civil Elegies, I believe, which I was reading again the other day. How do you deal with language differently as an adult poet as opposed to the little kid poet that you are?
Well, the first difference, and I don't really understand why it works this way, is that the children's stuff is almost all in the older conventions, meaning that it tends to rhyme, and even more basically, although this gets into sort of technical things, it's not in metrical rhythm. You know, da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum da 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 dum da dum da dum da dum da dum da dum da da. Well, that's a caricature of metrical rhythm, but the traditional English language poetry for centuries worked with a metrical basis for how the rhythms unfolded. And in the last 50 or 100 years, the dominant tradition in North America has been free verse, which has a different basis for rhythm. My adult stuff is pretty much all in free verse, and my children's stuff is pretty much all in the older conventions. So I think that would be the bigger difference, not so much language itself. But the truth is, when I'm prospecting for poems, whether they're for kids or for adults, I proceed very much the same way, really. I mean, there's a kind of pre-verbal energy that I wait to come tumbling through, and if it doesn't, anything I write is going to be pretty crappy.
How do you actually know that something is worth writing about?
I don't know in advance at all. I mean, I have absolutely no idea. And something that just seizes me with the force of epiphanic revelation. When I sit down and write it, it may be very good, or it may be complete junk.
Is it the act of writing that brings it into focus, or that brings it out?
I always have the sense that there's something there, and I'm trying to let it come through. You know, like if your radio set isn't quite, you're having trouble getting the station, you keep twiddling the knob, and it will come and go. I have a sense sort of like that. So it doesn't feel so much like me trying to write something that will equal an inspiration, but rather trying to find a way of letting the thing come through onto the page, which involves for me a huge amount of revision usually. It doesn't have to, for lots of people don't, but it seems to be the path I take
I've read some of the things you've written about being a Canadian writer and discovering that, what that meant to be a Canadian writer. But somewhere in the midst there, you also mentioned that you're a big fan of the Canadian Shield.
Yeah, the first
Big chunk of rock, eh?
big chunk of rock, man. The first few times I found myself there, I don't know, my body sense was just, I know this, I've been here. I've had the same experience getting to the Highlands of Scotland, which is very much the same terrain. I think it was formed around the same period in the Earth's geological history. It's funny, isn't it? You come to a place, it may be a city, it may be a countryside, and you feel as if you've known it, in some previous existence or whatever. I don't go in for that, but just the feeling of, yes, I belong here. And the Shield sure has that. That has nothing to do with nationalism or anything else. It's a body sense.
How important is silence for a writer, both in the act of writing and in the work that's written?
That's a lovely question. I guess I can't answer for a writer or all writers, but for me it's where things come from, where the words come from. If they're not rising up out of the silence with that the beginning of that churn of energy, then I don't think there's any reason to write them down in the first place. They'll just be the mental mind going, yeah.
I also read in your biography there that you had two grandfathers that were Methodist ministers, and both of your parents were high school English teachers.
That's right.
It's kind of a combination of grammar and religion, or what? How did that shape you?
Well, I only knew one of my grandfathers. My mother's dad died well before I was born. But they were both Methodist pastors, which I guess the other one lived long enough to become a United Church minister. So that strand of Protestantism certainly was part of my growing up. And on the face of it, it was, it's often considered to have been very antithetical to the imagination, that such things were frivolities and not to be. When my mother grew up, there couldn't be you couldn't play solitaire on Sunday because that was cards and the devil's work. My own childhood wasn't like that at all.
But you didn't want to be an English teacher or a minister?
When I was young, I thought of being a minister, which had nothing to do with my grandparents. I thought I had a calling to that. I decided in my early 20s that I didn't. But I came to university thinking I was going to go into theology after.
Got sidetracked, became a writer. We're going to come back right after this very briefly here, and you're going to read us maybe a couple more poems before we go.
You got it.
Thank you. We'll be right back in a second. My guest today has been Dennis Lee, and he has a new book there called Bubblegum Delicious, and we're going to get a couple more poems before we go.
Yes. How about the King of Calabogie? The King of Calabogie had a tickle in his throat. He coughed a long and mighty cough, and up came a goat. The goat the king provoked began to butt his highness flat. It horked a long and mighty hork, and up came a cat. The cat the goat begat began to guzzle apple juice. It burped a long and mighty burp, and up came a goose. The goose the cat produced began to flap like anything. It honked a long and mighty honk, and up came a king. Back to the beginning. Here's one called The Spider's Web. The sun upon a spider's web makes jewels in the air, as though the light was tangled up in someone's windy hair, or in a flight of skipping stones across a river's flare, or in a mind of many thoughts whose owner isn't there.
Dennis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.